Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure I'm starting this evening's meeting. We've suffered from all kinds of little problems, including the technician arriving very late. And in a minute I'll go and collect the stuff from outside because of all these problems and the Zoom. So we're starting. I'll just say in Hebrew, כפי שפורסם, ההרצאה היום היא באנגלית, ובסוף מי שירצה או דברים, אם יהיה צורך, אני אוכל אולי להוסיף, לסדר או מה בעברית. בכל מקרה, אני מבקש מכולם לוודא את כיבוי המכשירים הסלולריים, בגלל זה שזה מאוד חשוב. I'd like everyone to please make sure your cell phones are switched off, so we'll have no digital interruptions. And it is with great pleasure and honor that I introduce Dr. Alan Hertz from Canada, our lecturer for this evening. Alan, we are extremely grateful for you, for your kind suggestion, for sharing with us your research and the results of your research, and we are very keen to listen to you. So, Alan, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, first of all, apologies for not speaking in Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew. I know a whole bunch of languages, but not Hebrew. Second of all, I'm really pleased that so many people have come to listen to this topic. What I'm going to say this afternoon is already reflected. I guess that you could call it a book. I mean, there's about 300 pages on the internet, and to get to it, you just have to type in Hertz as in rent a car, and then Jews, Napoleon, and the Ottoman Empire, the 1797, I guess it should be 1799 proclamations to the Jews. Yeah, 1797 to 1799 proclamations to the Jews. So it's about 300 pages, and it's in 4 parts. The first part deals with some of the ideology of the French Revolution. It has a very long section on who Napoleon was, and actually who Napoleon was is very different from what people believe in France and what the sort of cult of Napoleon in France. Then it talks about French foreign policy, but it's really French foreign policy about the Jewish people, because it's not just Napoleon who suddenly, out of the blue, leads an army into Italy and goes from town to town and sends Jewish soldiers to burn down the ghetto walls and to free the Jews, to tell them to take off their yellow badges and to put on the red, white, and blue of the French Revolution. It's not just Napoleon, it's the Directory in Paris, it's the French generals generally of the revolutionary armies. So there was a French foreign policy that was concerned with human rights, and at the center of human rights was the Jewish people. Just like in the last 20, 30 years, people make such a big tsimus about the black people in the United States or in Canada. There's this left-wing human rights focus on focusing on the rights of black people and ending discrimination against black people. So the French Revolution is all about emancipating the Jews. I mean, many other things. Okay, very important to understand that the French Revolution is not just an event that happened in 1789. The French Revolution is a process, is a period of history that goes from 1789 until 1799, when in November of 1799, Napoleon led a right-wing coup against the French Revolution. But just months before that coup, Napoleon was on the left, the radical left. So what do I mean? The French Revolution lasted for 10 years. What was the main characteristic of the French Revolution? Hatred for the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church was the archetype of Western civilization. It was the backbone of European civilization. It was the remnant of the Roman Empire, and the legitimacy of the kings, let's say of Louis XVI, was very much bound up with the Roman Catholic Church. So for 10 years, the French Revolution trashed Roman Catholicism. They humiliated the church, and Napoleon was right at the head of that. Napoleon was a bitter enemy of the Roman Catholic Church. He helped draft the orders for the creation of the Roman Republic, to drive the Pope from Rome, to take him as a prisoner to France. He was totally a chameleon who, before he became the leader of France as first consul in 1799, 1800, 1801, 1802, before that time, he was an enemy of the church. When he became the ruler of France, he began a process of reconciliation with the Roman Catholic Church. There was a period throughout the time when Napoleon was the head of state in France, whether as first consul or whether as emperor, he increasingly moved with a reactionary zeitgeist. There was a spirit of reaction. There was a spirit of anti-Semitism. There was a spirit of return to Roman Catholicism, which began with the 1801 Concordat between Napoleon and the papacy, and then kept on moving down till we had the restoration of Louis XVIII, and then we had in Europe the period of the reaction. So when you get to the period of the reaction, the 1820s, 1830s, up until 1848, if you have a Jewish historian in the 1820s who is writing about the history of the Jewish people, don't expect him to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and don't expect him to be grateful to the French Revolution for emancipating the Jews, because that was forbidden in the period before 1848, in the period of the reaction, in the period of Metternich. You couldn't write in Europe about nice things about the French Revolution, and you couldn't write anti-Catholic things. Napoleon is not some guy from the boondocks. He's not a little Roman Catholic guy from some Catholic from speaking Corsican. He is, first of all, the son of two revolutionaries. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, and his mother, Letizia Ramolino, they were both Paulisti. They backed the Corsican Revolution. So the Corsicans were fighting for their freedom from around 1729 until 1769. The year that Napoleon was born was the year that France finally conquered Corsica and ended the revolution that in its last years was led by Pasquale Paoli. Okay, so for little Napoleon, who spoke Italian, he spoke Tuscan Italian. He knew the Corsican, but the language in Ajaccio was Tuscan Italian. Why? Because in the port towns of Corsica, people didn't speak Corsican. At least people who were from the upper class, they spoke Tuscan Italian. Carlo Bonaparte, Napoleon's father, went to school in Tuscany at the university, I think the University of Padua. Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, also studied law at the University of Padua. They all spoke Italian. Napoleon's mother wrote in Italian. Napoleon is simply Italian, you know. And certain French historians, like Patrice Guenefy today, or Blainville in the 1930s, they talked about the francisation, la francisation de Napoleon. So Napoleon is supposed to come as a 9-year-old, you know, by the time I was 9, I grew up in Quebec. By the time I was 9, all my ideology about being Jewish in Montreal, everything was formed by the time I was 9. My mother tongue, English, my political ideas about Canada, everything was formed. It was only when Napoleon was 9, an Italian guy at 9, he goes to school to learn French at Autun and then at Brienne. But for Blainville and Patrice Greniffy, these French people have the idea that la francisation, he became a Frenchman. Talleyrand, after the collapse of the First Empire in 1814, Talleyrand issued a proclamation that Napoleon was never a Frenchman. That appeared in the proclamation to the army and also in the proclamation to the people. And in 1797, in there's pamphlets we have that people said, who better to conquer Italy than a Corsican? Than a Corsican and an Italian. They said both. Napoleon himself, we have documents we have the accounts, Napoleon in exile on St. Helena in 1815, 16, 17, 18. He was always talking, and he had various confederates, various acolytes who were writing down what he said. And Napoleon himself vehemently denied that he was Corsican. You see, the French historians like to emphasize that Napoleon is Corsican so they can look down on his origins and they can say he was ennobled by la francisation. He became French. He ascended, Aliyah. He ascended to being he ascended to being a Frenchman. But in reality, he was an equal to being a Frenchman. He was an Italian. And Napoleon himself on St. Helena, he said, I'm either French or Italian. He was equivocating about being, I'm French, I'm Italian, I'm French. The only thing he denied, he said, I'm not Corsican. He regarded that as an insult, and it's meant to be an insult, and it has something to do in an indirect way with the Corsican independence movement and France's desire to reject the Italian nature of Corsica and the Italian history of Corsica. Italian remained the public language on Corsica till around 1858. So we have Napoleon's brother in 1792 is trying to defend the family, the Bonaparte family, from accusations, and he writes to the French commander in Ajaccio, and he writes to the French commander in Italian. The great collection of Napoleon documents, Correspondance de Napoléon Ier, which was achieved under Napoleon III, they never tell you which documents were originally written in Italian and only subsequently translated into French. But Napoleon was perfectly bilingual, and he wrote, very often he wrote in Italian. And in 1798, when he was in Egypt, he told his officials, his spies, military people, he said, write to me either in French or Italian, it doesn't matter. And when he was finally at the end of his life on St. Helena, and he had the problem of dealing with Sir Hudson Lowe, who was the British governor of St. Helena. He was trilingual. He could speak, Sir Hudson Lowe could speak English, French, and Italian. They asked Napoleon, what language do you want to have the connection with the British government on St. Helena? What language will you speak? Napoleon couldn't speak French. Napoleon was not gifted in languages. He was very good in English. He was very good in French and Italian, but he never mastered English. And at school, he studied German, but he never got very far. So as brilliant as he was, he didn't have this Fingerspitzengefühl. He didn't have this ease in learning in learning foreign languages. So Napoleon opted to speak to the British governor of St. Helena in Italian. And for example, we have that famous book. We have the famous book by Napoleon's doctor, Irish doctor O'Meara. So, which was published, I think, first in 1821 in English. But O'Meara, who had a long history in the Mediterranean serving with the British Navy, he always spoke to Napoleon in Italian. And all the discussions of what Napoleon said to O'Meara are all O'Meara's rendering in English of what Napoleon said in Italian. So, so Napoleon is he's slightly different from what we imagine him, and I would emphasize that I said by origin he was very sympathetic to the French Revolution, but I'll even go further and say that the little Napoleon was not some little Roman Catholic stooge. Napoleon from birth, almost from birth, was a child of the 18th century Enlightenment. And as I said, his parents were revolutionaries. So this idea that he comes from the boondocks, like for me, it's like in Quebec, somewhere in the backwoods, and he's a Corsican, and he's not really a revolutionary, and then he makes his peace with the Roman Catholic Church, and then France can reconcile, can say Napoleon isn't a revolutionary, he doesn't hate the Roman Catholic Church. It's all made up for the purposes of French history, for the purposes of the Second Empire, let's say, or for purposes of whichever regime or whichever historians. So he was a child of the Enlightenment. Okay, so what do I mean? Okay, who were Napoleon's heroes? And this is all covered in part one. Who was Napoleon? Who were Napoleon's heroes that until quite late governed his ideology? First of all, Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican revolutionary leader. Before George Washington and before the American Revolution, Pasquale Paoli and the Corsican Revolution was the premier revolutionary cause in Europe. It was the most famous revolutionary cause, and Pasquale Paoli was regarded, like George Washington, he was regarded as a champion of the 18th century Enlightenment, like taking the Enlightenment and putting it into revolutionary practice. Okay, what the other heroes are Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Abbé Raynal, and Robespierre. So these are the people that determined the ideology of Napoleon. Some of them when Napoleon was very young, and some of them, like Robespierre, during the beginning of the French Revolution. What is the commonality of Pasquale Paoli, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Abbé Raynal, and Robespierre? They're all philo-Semitic. They all, in one way or another, fought for the Jews. They were all, okay, there was two aspects of this. One is you could simply be in favor of the emancipation of the Jews, or equal rights for the Jews. And under that category, we put Pasquale Paoli and we put Robespierre. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as one of the most famous philosophers of the 18th century, and the most important philosopher for the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that the Jews should be gathered together and they should have a country of their own. The same was true of the Abbé Raynal. The Abbé Raynal, for example, in his many volumes, he has a passage, in many volumes which Napoleon read more than once, he has a passage where he emphasizes the peoplehood of the Jews, just as Rousseau does. He emphasizes the peoplehood of the Jews. And then in another passage, he said, oh, if only the Jews could have their own country, gathered together in their own country, maybe somewhere in the Americas, maybe in Jamaica. This is what the Abbé Raynal writes. And what Rousseau had written was, Rousseau wrote in his book Émile, or about education, Émile ou de l'éducation, Rousseau wrote, I'll never believe what the Jews really have to say until they have their own country. Un état libre, with a capital E acute, un état libre, until the Jews have their own country and their own universities, and then I'll believe what the Jews said. And Robespierre, though he didn't talk about a country for the Jews, very early in the French Revolution, Robespierre spoke out for the emancipation of the Jewish people of France. Now, Pasquale Paoli, he lived, Corsica was right near Livorno. Livorno had a population maybe of 6,000 Jews, 4,000 Jews. They were extremely rich. They were extremely successful. They provided money, munitions, and cannon, artillery. They provided artillery for the Jews of the Corsican Revolution. And this was happening in the 1760s under Pasquale Paoli, and it was happening also in the 1730s before Pasquale Paoli, when Dutch Jews provided artillery for the Corsican revolutionaries. Do we know for certain that Napoleon knew that Pasquale Paoli invited Jews to settle in Corsica and promised them equal rights? I don't know. But we know with absolute certainty that Napoleon knew that the Jews of Livorno and Amsterdam provided artillery and munitions and money to the Corsican revolutionaries. So this is an aspect. Chas v'chalila, French historians should have to recognize that Pasquale Paoli had a Jewish policy and that he implemented it, and that we have documents in Italian. This is not, in the study in part 1, I have a section on Pasquale Paoli, I have a section on Rousseau, on Raynal, and on Robespierre. So there's no doubt that Pasquale Paoli was Philo-Semitic. And also, the famous English diarist, James Boswell, he went to Corsica in 1765, and he spoke with Paoli, and he wrote this account of Corsica in English. It's the most famous book ever written about Corsica, and Boswell. It was a very famous book because it was very revolutionary. Boswell knew Rousseau, and it's all full of the ideology of the French Revolution, of the revolutionary ideology of the Enlightenment, because it's years before the French Revolution. And Boswell is talking up revolution. He's thinking about the Scottish resistance to the British, to the English. But when Boswell talks about Paoli, he's saying that Paoli imagined himself like Yehuda Maccabee, and that Paoli identified the Corsican people with the Jewish people. So there's absolutely, this is like unknown to French. I always say, if you go back to around 1900 to some of the classic books, like de la Jonquière's de l'expédition d'Égypte, the French expedition to Egypt, a classic book in 5 volumes written by a French military officer. All these people are anti-Dreyfusards. They're all royalists and they're all anti-Semites. They're all anti-Semites. They wouldn't see Jewish history if it crawled on the floor and bit them on their ankle. They wouldn't recognize Jewish history. So the fact that we have all this proof that Paoli, who was the alpha and omega of young Napoleon's belief and ideology, his whole universe was based on he was a little boy, and he wanted to know everything about the revolution. When he came back on leave from the French army in 1786, and in subsequent years, he went around talking to people who had participated in to other Paolisti who had participated in the revolution on Corsica, and he collected documents and read books in Italian and in French about the Corsican Revolution. So none of this for the French historians, for Patrice Guéniffy, for Blainville, for whatever, the Orthodox French historians, maybe even for the Jewish French historian Jacques Gaudichaud, none of this exists because they didn't look for it. Yes?
Can you explain why the Jews supported the Corsican Revolution? What was the interest of the Jews to support
Okay,
Sounds crazy.
the Corsicans promised that the Jews could come and settle on Corsica, and they could live by Jewish law, and they could be safe on Corsica. And this was starting in the 1730s, even before Pasquale Paoli. So there were some jurisdictions, like ultimately in Tuscany, where there was reform and there was more openness towards Jews. But then nearby in the Papal States, in the late 18th century, there was enhanced discrimination against Jews. So if one is talking about the 1730s and the 1760s, there's Jewish interest in the possibility of going to Corsica. And we can read about it in the London Chronicle from 1765. Okay, the London Chronicle from 1765. So this is, it's sort of an indication of, it's an indication of who Napoleon was. And as long as people treasure these illusions, going to the main point. So what is this lecture about? Did Napoleon issue an invitation to the Jews to return to Eretz Israel? And if he did, why? So for people who don't know who Napoleon was, it's inconceivable. They just, those Zionists are making up a story. So for example, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine in 1947, they were coming to the recommendation of whether Palestine should be partitioned into three: the Jewish state, the Arab state, and the international area of Jerusalem. So the Jewish agency in Palestine and Zionists worldwide were working desperately to convince countries to vote for the partition of Palestine in November 1947, and they put together a big binder of historical documents and material. One of the items that was presented to the United Nations in 1947 was an article in a periodical called The New Judea. And The New Judea in 1940 published a document in English which had been discovered in Vienna in 1940. And what it was the German, from 1799, the German translation of a Hebrew letter, the contents of which was Napoleon's invitation to the Jewish people. Okay. So Jacques Gaudichaud, the famous Jewish historian in France, Jacques Gaudichaud, most of whose work is not about Jews. So this is a typical Jew from France in the historical period who's trying to pretend that he's a super Frenchman. He's like Frenchman AAA plus plus plus. So he doesn't want to be, he can study the history in some article about the Jews of Nancy or something, but basically his main line of writing is about French history and revolutionary history generally. Okay, so in 1976, Jacques Gaudichaud, he writes an article called The Jews and the French Revolution. And he comes to the point where he has to discuss that on May the 22nd, 1799, the Paris newspaper Le Moniteur announces that Napoleon has issued a proclamation to the Jews of Africa and Asia to rally to his banners in order to restore their ancient Jerusalem, afin de restaurer Jerusalem ancien, l'ancien Jerusalem. Okay, so Jacques Godechaux, this great historian, whose ability we don't, great Jew, who's a great French historian. First of all, he quotes Le Moniteur from 1799, May 22nd, and he misquotes it. Instead of saying restaurer l'ancien Jerusalem, instead of restoring ancient Jerusalem, which is totally kosher for the French revolutionaries, he puts restaurer le royaume de Jerusalem, which is impossible for the French Revolution because it's redolent of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. It's a Roman Catholic expression. How Jacques Godechaux could get that quotation wrong is only one answer. He didn't bother to read it. He didn't bother to read it. Also in that same article, Jacques Godechaux reacts to the item in the New Judea from 1940, which had in English the proclamation, the text of Napoleon's invitation to the Jews to go back to Eretz Israel, and Godechaux said it's a fake. Okay. Godechaux never read the original German document. Even Simon Schwarzfuchs, the famous French Jewish historian, who also talks about whether or not this document from 1790, this Napoleon document is authentic, he also never read the German material.
He also believes it's a fake.
He also believed it's a fake. Godechaux believed it was a fake. The reason he gave, like in his brief, he believed it was a fake because it was dated from Jerusalem on April the 20th, 1799. So he said that proves it's a fake. But he didn't bother to understand the document in the context of the propaganda of the French Revolution. He didn't understand that the document is 100% a French revolutionary document. Whether Napoleon wrote it or agents of the Directory in Paris, it's totally authentic. No one has ever said that this document was not from 1799. No one has dared to say it was a forgery from 1880 or by Herzl in 1890 something. No historian has said it's not from 1799. It is so authentically a French revolutionary document. And on April the 20th, yes.
The Crusades state name
Was the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
I suggest, no. In the end, I suggest all questions.
It's okay. I don't mind.
Repeat the name.
The name of the Crusader kingdom was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, le royaume de Jérusalem. And no revolutionary. They so hated the Catholic Church. They so despised the Catholic Church. The revolutionaries were philo-Semitic. They wrote nice things about Jews. If you read the newspapers from 1796, 1797, 1798, there's hardly a reference in the French press that doesn't present Jews like 1967. The Jews have guns. They fought to defend Ancona. You know, the Russians landed in Senegalia. The Jews fired on them. Like everywhere, there is tribute paid by the French revolutionaries to the Jews, and so it's a totally different. So for the editors of the newspapers, okay, the great Jacques Godechaux, who immediately, so he said, well, you know, it says that it's dated from Jerusalem on April the 20th, 1799. This is a great man. Doesn't he know prolepsis? Doesn't he know that there's a rhetorical figure of speech where for dramatic emphasis, you claim something has already happened, which is going to happen, and doesn't he know the proclamation that Napoleon issued in Arabic and other languages before his invasion of Eretz Israel in February 1799? He claims that the French army has already been to Damascus and Cyprus. It's a type of exaggeration. And why would Napoleon, who's trying to revolutionize the Jews of the Mideast, why would Napoleon, and maybe even beyond, why would he issue a letter of propaganda from the siege works of Acre? Like, what sort of heft or persuasiveness is it to issue propaganda from the siege works of Acre, where Ahmed Jazar Pasha in Acre, in Akko, is resisting Napoleon, and Sir Sidney Smith and the British Navy are resisting the French? So this is April 20th, 1799. Napoleon wouldn't have known at that point that the siege of Acre would fail and that his attempts to conquer all of Syria would be frustrated. So, okay. Jacques Gaudichaud also, he talked about, this great French historian in 1976, he talked about the item in Le Moniteur. Okay, if I'm not wrong, there were 4 French newspapers in Paris on that day that carried the story of Napoleon's proclamation to the Jews. So it was Le Journal de Paris, the Moniteur, the Le Publiciste, or anyways, there were 4 papers. Do they need Alan Hertz from Montreal? Do they need me? And I'm very serious. The standard story for all historians up until now, no historian has written, in all recorded history, there's no one who has written as much about Napoleon's invitation to the Jews as I have. Even Franz Kobler, who found through a refugee who came from Vienna in 1940, he opened up a piece of tissue paper, and on the front side of it was a typewritten copy of Napoleon's letter, translation into German. On the back was a covering letter from a certain Rabbi Aaron, and Franz Kobler was amazed. And then he wrote all sorts of things, and then he died in 1965. And then some 10 years later, after his death, there appeared this book, Napoleon and the Jews, 1975. It's far inferior to the papers of Franz Kobler. Like in doing history of this, there's the world before the internet and the world after the internet. Schwarzfluch, Gaudichaud, a lot of people, they never had access to the Franz Kobler papers. Because of the internet, I have studied the Franz Kobler papers. And the Franz Kobler papers have the Napoleon proclamation in German and have all sorts of material. But Kobler's book in 1975 is far inferior to the writing of Franz Kobler and his actual papers that one can read. So Gaudichaud didn't know that there were four Paris newspapers on May 22nd. And certainly Gaudichaud didn't know. He knew something about maybe there had been something previously in the Gazette de Hamburg. But the British Bomber Command during World War II dropped so much incendiary and other bombs on Hamburg that the Gazette de Hamburg no longer exists. A lot of the libraries of Hamburg were just incinerated. So we know sort of what was in the Gazette de Hamburg about this Napoleon proclamation because it was requoted in German newspapers. So Gaudichaud knew that there was something in the Gazette de Hamburg, but he never saw it because, well, I guess in 1976 it didn't exist anymore. But what Gaudichaud didn't know, that there were 20 newspapers. In May of 1799, there were 20 newspapers in Europe that announced this. Napoleon had issued a proclamation to the Jews. And later on, there were newspapers in the United States that also had this news. So in 1799, whether it was the German philosopher Herder or whoever it was, you couldn't find a person in Europe in 1799 who didn't believe the story that Napoleon had issued a proclamation to the Jews. But for Jacques Godechaux, it was improbable because he never bothered to do the research. He didn't take it seriously. Simon Schwarzfuchs, in his book about the Sanhedrin, Simon Schwarzfuchs, who's now probably in an old people's home if he hasn't died, here in Israel. Simon Schwarzfuchs, in his book on the Assembly of Notables of 1806 and the Sanhedrin of 1807, he has opportunity to comment not only on the Napoleon letter, but also on the covering letter by a certain rabbi. And one of the things he said in the covering letter, they refer to the directions. It was the Jews in the various parts of the world, and it referred to them in connection with winds, like from the various times of the day, like the midnight Jews and the Mittag Jews, the noontime Jews. And Schwarzfuchs said this is ridiculous. But of course, he wrote his book in 1975 or something, 1979. And in those primitive days, you couldn't sort of like in a blitz, you couldn't like in 10 minutes find out meteorology terms of the 18th century. So because I'm the only historian who developed this topic in the age of the mature internet, we today can find material that it took months for historians to find. So for example, if you have all of Le Moniteur for the year 1799, or you have the Journal de Francfort, a French newspaper in Frankfurt. So you have a volume digitized by Google or whatever for 1799. You put in Juif, Jews, Juden, and bang, you have the 10 places in the 1,000 pages where there's a discussion of Jews. And this ability to, the fact that the mature internet, that people have been every month, they're digitizing more information, and there's more newspapers online in English, French, German, Italian, all these languages. It opens up the possibility for historical research that wasn't there in early periods. Okay. Evidence, absence of evidence, as a rule, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If you don't have proof of something, if you don't know something, you can't find indications. That's just absence of evidence. It's not evidence that it didn't exist. And the reason I raise that now is because now with the internet, with the mature internet and with digital searching, we can find things that people didn't find for decades. We can find many things. Another interesting point that relates to historiography, like doing history, like you can say absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is what is the standard? What is the standard for writing history? Okay? As far as anti-Zionists are concerned, as far as anti-Dreyfusards are concerned, there can never, and I correspond with some French historians like Henry Laurens, who completely rejects the idea that Napoleon issued invitations to the Jews. There's no proof that you can give to French Arabists, to anti-Semites, to anti-Zionists. There's no proof that you can give to them that will ever convince them that Napoleon issued an invitation to the Jews to return to Eretz Israel. But what is the standard for writing history? Okay, So there's various levels of proof. Let's say we could talk about it in terms of let's say in the common law jurisdictions, we could say for a civil law litigation, you win your case if on the balance of the evidence you've made your argument. The balance of the evidence. If the government is trying to put you in jail for an alleged crime, the government has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And then we could say, even more if we think we have the idea of scientific proof. So the idea was, let's say when you were in high school, you were in the chemistry class, and they gave you some wood shavings and you put it in a test tube and you heated it and it was supposed to produce certain results and you wrote up the experiment. Whatever you discovered in the test tube or whatever a scientist discovers in Moscow is supposed to be reproducible by a scientist at Stanford University. So you have the balance of probabilities, you have beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal law, and you have pure scientific proof. History mostly functions. Journalism, history, public policy, government, your own personal lives functions on the standard of balance of the evidence. There's very few things in life that we make decisions that we want absolute proof or that we're going to get absolute proof. But it is a trick of rhetoric. It is a trick of rhetoric when you're presenting to a person who doesn't want to hear about Napoleon inviting the Jews to demand absolute proof. So what do they want from absolute proof? They want you to produce a document from the French archives showing, so if we had the German version of the letter from Napoleon inviting the Jews to return, was translated by a Christian German called Fischer, who was employed for 30, 40 years by the Habsburg government in Austria-Hungary, in the Habsburg Empire. He was employed as the official Hebrew translator. And whenever the Habsburg spy service found an explosive, incriminating document in Hebrew, because Jews were writing to each other, the spy service, the Polizei Hofstelle in Vienna would send these documents to Fischer in Prague to translate. And okay, so the people, the skeptics will say, this document, we don't believe it. Like, all the writing from the classical world, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. Do you think that there's any document except on stone? Do you think there's any document that someone in the Roman Empire actually wrote on papyrus or on whatever they wrote on that actually survived beyond the Middle Ages and comes down to us today? How do we have Plato? How do we have the Roman historians? It's because of manuscripts that were recopied. So the letter from April 1799 in German is just a rendering of information that was taken from another source and was passed down in the same way that the whole corpus of Greek and Roman civilization was passed down from the ancient world to the Renaissance. But for the enemies of the Jewish people and for anti-Zionists, they will act as if the fact that it was recopied, it is, they're thinking in terms, they don't, the fact that it's the German translation of a Hebrew document that was probably originally written in Italian or French. To them, God forbid, this is not authentic. They suddenly have standards that are impossible to meet and aren't applied in the whole canons of history generally. Okay, so they want us to produce a document from the French archives, except Napoleon, in his whole career of glory and grandeur, he never had a failure comparable to the Mideast campaign of 1798. It went on to 1801, but Napoleon checked out in August 1799. He ran back to France. And he didn't want to admit that he failed in the Middle East. And he didn't, especially after 1801, he didn't want to admit that he had any philo-Semitic invitation to Jews. So what did he do? In 1802, he asked his secretary, when he was consul of France, he asked his secretary to go to the archives and bring him a big pile of documents about the Mideast campaign. And between 1802 and 1807, he went through all these documents and he put the ones that he wanted to suppress on the side. And maybe he even forged something, about something else, if he wanted to. He used to forge documents after the fact. But anyways, he separated from the Mideast campaign the documents that he found embarrassing. He put them aside, and in 1807, they were all burned. Okay? Now, if that wasn't bad enough, under Napoleon III, during the Second Empire, by which time the Empress Eugenie was an ultramontane Catholic, and France had policy in the Middle East and Catholic, all sorts of leadership of the Catholic world was fighting in 1854 with the Tsar of Russia over the holy sites in Jerusalem, and wanted to establish French leadership and Roman Catholic leadership in the Holy Land. They, according to, let's say, as early as an English historical review from 1898 or 1899, there's an article about how under Napoleon III they burnt documents, they suppressed documents. Okay? So furthermore, around 2012, there was a Jewish ambassador, a French ambassador, Jean Mendelssohn, who was his assignment during those years before he became the ambassador to Cuba. His assignment was Director General of the French Archives. And he told an interview, which is on the internet. He said, "You can't imagine the thrill it is to come upon a document in the French archives that was written by a famous person and has not been read by anyone for 200 years. So the fact that there are documents, not only things that were destroyed, but documents that no one has seen for 200 years is an established fact. And furthermore, Alon was told in Cuba in 2014, Jean Mendelssohn, as a French ambassador to Cuba, told him that there was proof in the French archives that Napoleon had backed
He said something like, "It's very likely it's there." He did not say it is there. He said, "Well, I would not be surprised."
Anyway, so this was the former Director General of the French Archives. So I want to say that if you're going back to 1800, this is before von Ranke. This is before the great German historians of the 19th century. This is before the famous Cambridge historians in English history. If you go back to the French archives, were founded in 1795, and I think in 1796, the legislation was that any citizen could go and consult the archives. But there didn't exist in the historical profession and in governments, there didn't exist this cult of the archives, this sanctity of the archives. So if Napoleon went around burning documents and also forging documents, pretending, writing in 1802, forging a document backdated to 1798 or something like that. You didn't have, it wasn't like this feeling we have, oh, the archives, we have to have the archives. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, in the 1920s, there was a German historian, a Jewish historian in Vienna. I think his name was Nathan Gelber. I may be getting his first name wrong. I think it's Gelber. And he wrote, among other books, he wrote The Prehistory of Zionism, Die Vorgeschichte des Zionismus. So Gelber said, he said, well, you know, we have this claim that Napoleon issued a proclamation to the Jews, but I'm in Vienna. I went to the Austrian archives. I've searched high and low in the Austrian archives. Austria had all sorts of diplomats in Istanbul, Constantinople. They didn't report anything about this. And my colleagues in Paris went through the French archives and they didn't find anything either. Okay. I'm sitting in China. I'm sitting in southern China. And I'm reading a doctoral dissertation that was written by a Turkish professor, by a Turk who ultimately was a professor at a university in Turkey. And it's all about the Mediterranean and the Russian fleet, and it's all about, you know, the history of 1798 and Nelson and you know, all sorts of Russian things. There's a little footnote that's for him is just a throwaway. And he says, and the Russian Tsar, Paul, wrote about Napoleon wanting to reestablish the Jewish Republic. Okay, so it's very easy. If someone works at a university, it's very easy to get their email address. So I write to this guy at his university in Turkey, and I asked him, do you think you could send me this this document? And he said, well, when you go to the Moscow archives, you can only use a pencil. So you're required to copy the document in pencil. He said, but don't worry, I will send it to you in Russian. Okay? So what is it? It is a document, it is a letter from August of 1798, and the Tsar Paul, the Emperor of Russia, is writing to General Gudovich. And he says, hey, Gudovich, I just got a letter from the Russian ambassador in Constantinople, Tamara. Privy Councillor Tamara has sent me a letter. And you know what? He says that on July 1st, Napoleon has arrived in Alexandria. And he said, he's here to reestablish the Evreskaya Republika, the Jewish Republic in Jerusalem. So he said, Jewish Republic in Jerusalem. And then he goes on to say, and he told me that the Sultan Selim III, is interested in having Russian help to fight Bonaparte. Okay, so
what is the date of this letter?
This is the 17th of August, I think, 1798. Okay. So all the, you know, Patrice Guineffe and Jacques Godichot and Simon Schwarzfuchs, Nathan Gelber, all the people who said, there's nothing from the archives. There's nothing from the archives. Well, there is. There's a document from the Emperor of Russia who knows about Napoleon's intention to found the Evreskaya Republika in Jerusalem. Okay. I was also when I was living in China, I was reading another Turkish doctoral dissertation. And there was another little throwaway footnote. And it said Ahmet Cevdet Pasha. Now, Ahmet Cevdet Pasha in the mid-19th century was the official historian of the Ottoman Empire. And he was given by the Sultan, he was given the responsibility to write Ottoman history from 1774 till, I don't know, 1820 something, whatever. And so in the 1850s, he collected all the material from the Ottoman archives, and he wrote, it's published several times into the late 19th century, he wrote in Ottoman Turkish that the French revolutionaries, this was for the year 1797-8. I think it's the the Muslim year. Let's just scroll up because it's dealt with in the. Okay, it's the Muslim year 1212, and he writes about a revolutionary proclamation inviting Jews to establish a Jewish government in Jerusalem. Kutsi Sharifte Bir Yahud Hukumeti Teshkil in Ottoman Turkish. He says that this was known to the Ottoman Turks in 1212, 1797, 1798. So not only do we have from 1798 the Emperor Paul saying that Napoleon is going to establish the Evreiskaya Republika in Jerusalem, but we have the official historian, the Vakanuvis, the official historian of the Ottoman Empire for that period, is claiming that there was a proclamation to establish in Kutsi Sharif de Bir Yahud Hukumeti Teshkil. So the situation is already looking, it's not looking so exactly the way people thought it was for Jacques Godechaux in 1976 to reject everything out of hand. It's very okay. Okay. The title of my part of my study is Jews, Napoleon, and the Ottoman Empire, the 1797-1798 proclamations to the Jews, 1797-1799 proclamation to the Jews. Okay, this could be phrased differently. The title could really say Jews, Bonaparte, and the Suez Canal. Or it could say, it could be Jews, the Revolutionary General Bonaparte, and the Suez Canal. Okay. Part 3 of my study is all about the Suez Canal, and it's about the Evreiskaya Republika, the Jewish Republic, and what Napoleon's intentions were for the Jewish Republic and why. Okay. What is the big news here? Part 3 is all about the Suez Canal, and it's all based in material from 1798 and 1799. It's no bullshit from 1802. It's no bullshit from 1900. It's the people like the great French historians, Jules Charroux, who wrote around 1900 History of the Suez Canal. No. When you go back to 1798, 1799, you know the truth, not the wobbly, vague idea. Why did Napoleon go to Egypt? He went to Egypt to strike a blow against England. British trade did not, in any reasonable extent, travel through the Red Sea, through Egypt to the Mediterranean. There was another route that went, to some extent, it went through the Persian Gulf from Basra to Aleppo or whatever. That was the minor route for British trade. British trade went around the Cape of Good Hope. The British East India Company had tremendous merchantmen, and they traveled from India to Great Britain. And Napoleon promised to, in June of 1798, aboard L'Orient, aboard the biggest battleship in the world, he was sailing from Malta to Alexandria. And he said to the soldiers, we all know the quote, where he said, respect the Muslims just like you respect the Jews, respect the imams just as you respect the rabbis. And Napoleon said on St. Helena, I purposely put the rabbis and the Jews ahead of the Roman Catholics because otherwise my revolutionary compatriots wouldn't have listened to me. But he admitted that on St. Helena. But before he gave that part of his address, he said, I am going to strike a blow against England. We're on this mission to strike a blow against England, the heaviest blow you can imagine. So taking Egypt is going to be the heaviest blow? No. Napoleon went to Egypt for one reason and one reason only. He went to Egypt to build the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal was already scoped in the French archives in 1779 Le Baron de Tott and de Lannes, they were in the Isthmus of Suez, and the whole plan to build the Suez Canal was already well known in the French archives and French government. And in 1797, Gaspard Monge, the former Navy minister, great scientist, great mathematician, but he had been the Navy minister. He went to the section for the maps and memoranda of the French Navy, and he took them to Napoleon, because already in 1797, when Napoleon had conquered Italy, and he was in Passariano, he was in Eastern Italy, he was negotiating with the Austrians, he was already planning to invade Egypt. And the London newspaper of 1798 says, in 1797, Napoleon went to the Milan Library and he took out all the books about the Middle East, all the French and Italian books. So we know this because we read the newspapers, we know what, okay. So Napoleon was deep in study about Egypt, conquering Egypt. And his buddy, General Desaix, arrived in Passariano, and they had a discussion which Desaix records in his diary. And Desaix says that Napoleon spoke to him about the Isthmus of Suez. So Napoleon intended, this is a Weltgeschichtliche, this is a world historical geostrategic coup. Napoleon intended to build the Suez Canal. He didn't intend to reopen the riverine route. Like you could have a route, there's a canal from Alexandria to the Nile River, and then along the Nile, and then from the Nile to the Bitter Lakes, and from the Bitter Lakes down to Suez. He didn't intend to open that route because it could never accommodate warships. The only thing that could accommodate a warship would be a canal dug 8 meters deep directly from Suez to the Bitter Lakes and the Bitter Lakes to the Mediterranean coast. Napoleon purposely always created a lot of confusion as to whether or not he was interested in the river route, which was militarily worthless, or whether he was interested in this direct canal. Okay. He left Toulon and the other ports in May of 1798 for the invasion of Egypt. And we know what was packed aboard those ships, okay? And he had packed aboard those ships 22,000 iron digging tools. And I've done comparative analysis. No French Royal Army of the 18th century or Revolutionary Army of the 18th century ever carried 22,000 iron digging tools. So you get by 1809, you can get to 50,000 digging tools, but the French army involved was 400,000. So we're talking now an army of 40,000 men who are going across the Mediterranean. They have 22,000, 21,000, 22,000 digging tools. And they have 35 civil engineers. The army had plenty of military engineers. But why does Napoleon go to Egypt with 35 civil engineers and 22,000 shovels? Okay, these shovels were probably, in the 18th century, warships had ballast to keep stability for the ships. And most of the ships at that time, they had the iron bars or stones at the bottom of the ship. But the French fleet, they wanted to maximize every pound of cargo, every item. So they probably didn't have the handles for the shovels, but they probably had the iron shovels at the bottom of some ships as ballast. And then when on August 1st, 2nd, 1798, the French fleet was either destroyed or ran away, and the Napoleon's shovels disappeared. And so Napoleon in Egypt and in Israel, he didn't have shovels. We know that he was very short of shovels. We know that from the documents. So he intended to go to Egypt to dig the Suez Canal, and he wanted to use the Jews. He wanted to establish the Jewish Republic. He wanted to establish a Maronite republic for the Shia Twelvers, for the Shiites. He wanted to liberate the Armenians, and he wanted to use all these Mideast peoples as a buffer for the French Canal. So, in other words, Napoleon prefigured, even before he left for the Middle East, he and Talleyrand had this idea: the French army would go and seize Egypt, and then Talleyrand would negotiate with the Sultan for so that the Ottomans, the Turks, would accept this, and to tell the Turks it would be good for the French to be in Egypt, and it would help the Ottoman Empire. But unfortunately, the Turks were very much afraid of the French. They were afraid of Napoleon. But the moment Lord Nelson, it was not Sir, it was Sir Horatio Nelson. He wasn't Lord Nelson yet. He destroyed the French fleet. The Sultan learned about it. He declared war on Napoleon, and everything. Napoleon's plans evaporated, and he never built the Suez Canal, and he never wanted to admit. Okay, archives. These maniacs, they always want us to bring us a document from the archives. They don't want to hear we have the Emperor Paul's. From the Moscow archive, we have the Emperor Paul. From the French archives, we have the secret order of April the 12th, 1798, which everybody downplays. The people who wrote books about the Suez history, the Suez Canal, people who write books about l'Expédition d'Orient or Napoleon in Egypt, they all don't want to accept the truth of the document from the French directory, the secret order commanding Napoleon to constitute l'Armée d'Orient, an army of the Orient, to seize Egypt and cut the Suez Canal, percer l'isthme de Suez. It says it in black and white. And before that, it says the British have taken the Cape of Good Hope from Holland. The British are blocking the French ships from going around the Cape of Good Hope. And France needs to break through, needs a way to send its ships through the Red Sea to India. So this is explicit. It's explicit that the Napoleon's task is to build the Suez Canal. Complete blindness. And people are sort of, well, he went and it was this idea and that idea. Okay. After, and this relates to the Jewish people. After, and remember that Napoleon very much admired the British. He very much admired the British in India. He admired Lord Clive. He admired how the British took over India, and he admired how the British ruled India through a bunch of Maharajas. So it was the East India Company and indirect British rule. So Nelson destroys the French fleet on August 1st, 2nd, 1798. Napoleon, he goes to Acre, and because now he can't get back to France because the fleet is gone. So in order to, if you're in Egypt, if you're in Cairo, every step you take toward Israel brings you closer to Paris, because that's the closest way by land from Egypt is to go around to through to Ankara and then over through Bulgaria and then to France. So once Napoleon was cut off, the French government wrote to him, and they said, you have some options here. You could try to go to India, which is very far away, or you could stay on the defensive in Egypt, or you could attack. You could go through Eretz Israel, you could attack through Anatolia and come back to Europe through Constantinople. So after Napoleon had this disappointment, he didn't have any shovels, he wasn't going to build the Suez Canal, he decided, particularly by March, April of 1798, he's going to do a Lord Clive. He's going to revolutionize.
March, April 1798?
1799, sorry.
But the invasion of Palestine.
Israel is in February of 1799. Yeah, but when he's in March 1799, he's in Jaffa, and in April he's in front of the siege works in Acre, and he's looking at the political problem of revolutionizing the Ottoman Empire and creating, like the French revolutionaries, and I really should end here. The French revolutionaries had this theory of the world exactly like the Comintern, like the Soviets. They believed that the French Republic, like Soviet Russia, the French Republic would rule the world in cooperation with sister republics. And Napoleon had this idea to create sister republics in Anatolia, in Armenia, in Eretz Israel, in Lebanon. And this was his logic in issuing propaganda to revolutionize the Jews. Okay, so that's really, there's more that could be said, but I think we've.
Yeah. Okay. I would like, first of all, thank you very much. I would like to add an important point which corroborates, in my humble opinion, to a large extent, the story, and I've used it very often sometimes in vehement discussions with historians who try to contradict me, who followed Schwarz-Fuchs and Godeshaw, etc. And by the way, the management of the people who were in charge of the Hebrew University, Hebrew Encyclopedia Ivrit, invited Jacques Godeshaw to write the term Napoleon in Encyclopedia Ivrit. And he wrote it, I think, in 1973. So just another involvement of Jacques Godeshaw. In 1899, Herzl writes a letter to the Kaiser.
Right.
And he writes him, you can do, of course, Herzl wants to encourage him, wants to get him on board with the idea of a Judenstaat. It's 3 years. Herzl published the Judenstaat in 1896, of course, after l'affaire Dreyfus, etc. And he says, you can do what Napoleon started 100 years ago and establish a Jewish state. So, you know, I mean, how would Herzl write something like that if it was a fake? So in my opinion, that's a trump card. You know, that's a very important argument in favor. And of course, something I would like to mention, and I've mentioned it before in this forum. My mentor and a great scholar who started the Israeli Napoleonic Society, Professor Mordechai Gichon, he was a firm believer that this document was a reality. There was indeed a proclamation, which got lost somehow, or destroyed, or whatever. So, you know, and what I am really upset, and I told Alan that when I was still much more into the military, my military studies and research, Mordechai mentioned to me that he had seen in his research documents referring to this proclamation, including, and I'm quoting him, documents I was the first one to see, some of which were even still were the pages stuck together with blood blotches. Documents I've seen in the archives, and I can now kick myself for not asking him where did he see it, for the reference now to come. unearthed these documents. And for those of you who don't know, in the archives, in the French military archives, there are, I don't know how many hundreds of kilometers of boxes with documents which are yet to be studied by historians. So I mean, there's work there for thousands of years, as there are in all European countries with archives of military and foreign affairs, etc., etc. Anyway, I think Alan has really enlightened us and added a lot of very useful information in a fascinating manner. I want to add also that this, in my opinion, when I look at the period, when I look how Napoleon really got Italian nationalism off the ground, Polish nationalism off the ground, of course with proclamations, with establishing republics like the Cisalpine Republic and the Transalpine Republic, like sister republics to the French Republic, etc. I feel, or I believe, that this proclamation to the Jews is fully in line with his custom of spreading the ideals of the revolution, but with also the French interest very much in mind. So I can see also by what Alan said, writing letters to the sheikhs and the imams and the leaders, etc. He was trying to get them on board for the French cause, mostly for French interests, of course, because, you know, since Machiavelli, it's clear that in politics, there is no such thing as right and wrong or good and evil. There's only an interest. And those who fail to understand it are either stupid, naive, or American presidents, which are sometimes both stupid and naive. But that's another thing. Anyway, if you have any questions, yeah, no, wait, of course.
First of all, did the Jews want to stay? I mean, whether he proclaimed it, that's one thing, but I would expect, let's say, a politician like Napoleon to have contacts with the leadership of the Jews, saying, well, I mean, I can imagine that he did that with the Polish rebels, or I don't, if I remember, there's nothing like that. The Jews were surprised.
The Jews in Jerusalem were terrified.
Yeah.
And they were terrified of the Ottoman Turks, and they were terrified especially of the Christian Arabs, who were the bitterest enemies of the Jewish people historically, and they were terrified of the Muslim Arabs. So the Jews in Jerusalem, they, for the most part, they didn't respond. But Napoleon sent a letter around March the 9th. He had a letter printed in Arabic or Ottoman Turkish, and he sent it to Jerusalem, inviting people to come down to talk to his camp, to promise that they wouldn't do anything against the French. And so some Ottoman governor of Jerusalem came, and then around that time, a delegation of Jews appeared in Jaffa, because Napoleon was in Jaffa, in the home of Damiani, and he met with the Jews, and they say he spoke Italian to them, and there was a Jewish merchant called Signor Azriel, and Signor Azriel told Napoleon that nothing will ever come of Eretz Israel unless you put the Jews in charge of the administration. So there were some Jews, including the Italian enthusiast Samuel Romanelli. There were revolutionary enthusiasts, and it was believed by Lord Nelson and by many people in the press that the Jews of Europe were the most enthusiastic partisans of the French Revolution. But it doesn't matter, because the Jews are a famous people of world history, and among the Goyim in Europe, they imagined that the Jews were believed what says in the Mishnah Torah from the late 12th century. The Mishnah Torah is an intensely political document. It sets out the requirements for the King of Israel, for the Jewish Republic. It's very political. It's the tenets of Judaism. Judaism is undeniably Zionist. There's no innovation of establishing the Jewish kingdom, there's no innovation that is more at the center of Orthodox Judaism. Although I know some sects say you have to wait for the Messiah you can't, but Maimonides writes about, so the Goyim knew, the Europeans knew, the people of the Enlightenment knew, first of all, about the Jewish people, and second of all, about the attachment of the Jewish people to Eretz Israel. So in the run-up to Napoleon's departure, or after Napoleon's departure in May 1798, for Egypt, there appeared in the French press articles about the Jews going back to Israel. And there's a very famous, it's dealt with in part one, tremendous analysis of something called a letter from a Jew to his brothers. And this appeared in a French newspaper on June the 8th, 1798, when Napoleon was already on the high seas. And it talks about a Jewish council, very much prefiguring the Sanhedrin. A Jewish council will meet with representatives from Jews all around Europe, and they will get the help of the French government to negotiate with Turkey to reestablish the Jews in Eretz Israel. And also there was a philosophical in a periodical called La Décade Philosophique. Before that, in April 1798, there's a big French article about the Jews going back to Israel. So the preparation for the propaganda for Napoleon's expedition is explicitly focused on giving a Jewish rationale. It's like exactly like Lloyd George. It's everything that the British did in 1917, 1918, 1919 to justify the British presence in Eretz Israel. They had to sell it to Woodrow Wilson. There was no way the British could have Palestine, even though they conquered it. There's no way the British could keep Palestine as part of the British Empire. And I'm not saying League of Nations. That's a bunch of bullshit. Palestine was under the sovereignty of King George V, period, full stop. Palestine was a British colony, period. The League of Nations never had sovereignty in Palestine. That's just a bunch of UN garbage. That's a lie. And you can read Lord Balfour, you can read, the British couldn't have come here unless they sold Woodrow Wilson the story that their presence here was to benefit the Jewish people, period. They were following. Napoleon had a problem. He was a revolutionary. He couldn't be like Adolf Hitler and say, the Sudetenland is Deutsch territorium. He couldn't do that. He was a revolutionary. He had to kosher every move to show that he was doing it to regenerate, la régénération des peuples de Moyen-Est, les peuples de l'Est. He wanted to show he was benefiting civilization. It was the la mission civilisatrice, later on in French.
He said in St. Helena that had he succeeded, that would be like King Solomon.
Yeah. So he ran into tremendous problems in Italy in 1797 when he made the Treaty of Campo Formio, and he divided certain Venetian territories between Austria and some Italian republics. In the French Parliament, they said, Napoleon is betraying the revolution. He is practicing like realpolitik. They didn't have that word, but he's practicing realpolitik. He's betraying the revolution. So Napoleon, in going to Egypt, he used the Jews in French public opinion. He wanted to confuse people to say, I'm going to restore the Jews. I'm going to help the people of the Middle East. There was a tremendous amount of pro-Jewish propaganda that was circulating in Paris in 1798.
I thought that one of the main ideas of the Egyptian expedition was to form a French colony that will be instead of the Antilles, of the colonies that they were going to lose.
Yes.
This was clear from Iran, and
That
So it
was,
was not only Suez Canal, but it was,
well, if
let's say,
if they built the Suez Canal, if they had succeeded in building the Suez Canal, they obviously didn't intend to leave Egypt.
right.
They didn't intend to leave Egypt. And they wanted to, and they didn't intend to directly rule the Middle East. They wanted to rule the Middle East through his Armenian Republic, through the Maronite Republic. They even were thinking about, they called it République Gallo-Grecque in Anatolia. It's all in the French newspapers. It's all in the French newspapers at the time. And yes.
Is there any record of discussion between Napoleon or indeed one of his predecessors in the revolution with the Turkish delegates regarding the idea of a canal? I mean, after all, Napoleon later on was on good terms with the Turkish ambassadors.
In the 16th century, it was in the 16th century that the Ottoman Turks defeated the Mamluks at the beginning of the 16th century, and they took Egypt. Yeah. And already in the course of the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks made several attempts to build the Suez Canal. One of them was in relation to a possible riverine route that I described. Another attempt was to cut the canal straight through. In the around 1774, I think it was. Yeah, Sultan Mustafa III, I think it was. He asked during that war. He asked a French military officer of Hungarian descent, Le Baron de Tott. He asked him to draw up a plan for a canal. And Mustafa III said, when the war is over, I will dig the Suez Canal. But, and this is a footnote in Baron de Tott's memoirs. Now, Napoleon read Le Baron de Tott at least twice. So Napoleon knew everything about this idea of the canal, not to mention all the documents that Monge got for him from the French archives from 1778 and 1799.
But I thought the reason that the canal, Suez Canal, wasn't dug was because they engineered exactly the differences in height.
Bullshit lie.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that's what I read.
Bullshit lie.
You think so? It was only because of the
okay. In part three. Okay. In part three on the Suez Canal, I have a long discussion of late 18th century science, including French science. And no one believed that the Red Sea was higher than the Mediterranean. Under Newtonian theory, there was this understanding of the equilibrium of the seas. If the water flows in at Gibraltar and it flows around Africa and up toward the Indian Ocean, how can the Red Sea? So it was. Napoleon fastened, like in his memoirs, when he wrote about the Egyptian campaign and the Syrian campaign on St. Helena, he talks about this bullshit that's 6 meters, 32 feet higher. It's all to cover himself because he was ordered to build the Suez Canal and he didn't do it. He never admits that he had 22,000 shovels and he lost it. He never admits that he was ordered directly because it was secret for decades. He never admits that he was ordered to build, literally ordered to dig the Suez Canal. And he was making up with his engineer. They never calculated the level of the two seas in Egypt. They went back to Paris to take all the readings, and they cooked it up in Paris, which was an excuse to exculpate Napoleon.
Why doesn't he mention? I mean, in St. Helena, why does he say when Linas cast, I wanted to build the canal, I wanted to connect?
Oh, he mentions a lot about the canal because the Napoleon deflected. He deflected in two ways. He talked a lot about, and in France they did, even under Napoleon, under Louis XVIII, under Louis Philippe, Napoleon talked up this idea of the canal, and he tried to say, I was examining the feasibility, and he said, I was looking for the ancient remains. And then they had all this bullshit about Egyptology, the pyramids, and they had all this brouhaha in France and in Europe. So they got cover for the failure of Napoleon to deflect, to turn the whole l'expédition d'Égypte into a cultural, an Egyptological fantasy.
But these shovels, where did he put them? I mean,
The shovels.
we know that the fleet was 400.
Yeah, the ship.
Right? So where did he put it?
Obviously, they were never unloaded.
But why? I mean,
because
are you sure that they were on the fleet that Nelson?
Well, it says they were loaded.
It
says they were loaded in Toulon, and the warships. You know, the ballast could be also for the warships. We don't know where the 20.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. The warships, on the warships, everything was calculated because the warships had also the ammunition and the stores, etc. There were a lot of transports. Now, the Armada was around 400 ships large, and only 17 of these were third, second, or first raters. There were a couple of fourth rated, fifth.
We don't know where the shovels were. They could have been. I mean, they could have been. It's just iron. It's just a bunch of iron, like plate. They could have been on the warships. They could have been on transport.
They were unloaded. Then they
no, I don't think.
Load ballast.
I don't think they were ever unloaded.
It sounds problematic.
Well,
I mean,
okay. So at one point, Admiral Bruet says in a document, "I've unloaded the stuff that belongs to the French army," but the commission scientifique. The 35 engineers, civil engineers, they're not part of the army. So if they didn't need the shovels yet, maybe they were never unloaded. But the fact is, we know from the French documents, there were 22,000 digging tools that left France. And we know that in Egypt and in Eretz Israel, Napoleon was short of shovels. I discuss all that in detail, the proof that Napoleon was short of shovels, the whole issue. And obviously, if he was going to go to dig the Suez Canal, he had to dig shovels. And why did he take 35 civil engineers? 35 civil engineers.
He needed bridges, he needed a lot of stuff.
And why was he ordered to cut the Suez Canal? I mean, you know, the final thing is the French documents from the archives say explicitly, cut the Suez Canal. And they say it so that the ships of France can go through. They don't talk about some riverine route, which means you arrive in Alexandria, you have to unload all your crap, you have to send it on barges up the Nile. Half the year the Nile is not navigable. You bring it down to Suez, you have to reload it. No, that is not what the French government said. They said, cut the Suez Canal so that our ships can go straight through. The problem is that people just didn't want to, they don't want to do it. Exactly. They don't want to do it.
Okay, we have to call it today. It's 15 minutes past 7. Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. For those of you who did not understand, Alan came especially to Israel, and very kindly so. So we are flabbergasted, and thank you ever so much, Alan. We are very grateful.
On the YouTube and distributed in a wide range.
Yeah, well, I hope indeed the recording was.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Get the name of this Turkish historian from the 19th century.
Ahmet Cevdet Pasha.
Can you write it down?
Yes.
Alan, in fact, did you know that Napoleon had a Jewish grandson?
A Jewish grandson? No, I didn't know.
So this is the son of Alexander Palevsky with the